Sound check one. Welcome to the Audit, Finance, and Administration Committee for Thursday, November 16th. And happy 1 year from our inauguration, everybody. It is today. Today's the day. 1 year we've all been here together. I'd like to call the meeting to order and let everyone know that quorum is here in the room with me today. Councillor Tammy Huang, Councillor Maureen Wilson, and Councillor Mark Pattison. And joining us through the power of the internet, Councillor Brad Clark, Councillor Alex Wilson, and Councillor Jeff Beattie. A reminder that if your cell phone makes loud noises, to please quiet it during the meeting. And we'll go on to the our first item up, which is item 2, approval of the agenda. Clerk Bates, are there any changes to today's agenda? I already know the answer, but please tell us what they are.
Yes, Chair Kretsch, there are several changes to the agenda. Under item 10, discussion items, item 10.3, Downtown Hamilton Business Improvement Area Amendment to Schedule of Payments, PED 23202, Ward 2. That report was revised, and the revised version of the report replaced the original report and was published as item 10.3A. However, that report has since been withdrawn. Similarly, item 10.4, Barton Village Business Improvement Area Amendment to Schedule of Payments, PED 23203, Wards 2 and 3. A revised version of that report was also replaced the original report and was published as item 10.4A, and that report has also since been withdrawn. We have added item 10.5, Development Charges Stakeholders Subcommittee Report 23003 from November 9th, 2023. And finally, we have one added notice of motion under item 12.1, Disaster Relief Assistance Water Main Break, Hyde Park Avenue and Glenside Avenue on November 12th, 2023.
Thank you very much for itemizing those changes. May I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda for today? So Councillor Huang and Councillor Pattison. Any discussion on the agenda as presented today? Not seeing discussion emerging. Please indicate your vote now. Or when it appears, I should say.
Apologies, Mr. Chair. The vote doesn't seem to want to come up.
Robots are not cooperating. We may take a manual vote, but we'll pause briefly while we consider that eventuality.
Let me see if I can. No, I believe we are going to need to take a manual vote, please.
A by hand vote it is. All those in favor? That's everyone. It's unanimous. It carries 1, 2, 3, 7-0.
Thank you.
And we're on to declarations of interest, which is item 3. Are there any declarations of interest for today's meeting? I'm not seeing any. We'll go on to item 4, the approval of the minutes of our last meeting on November 2nd. May I please have a mover and seconder to approve the minutes of the November 2nd meeting? I see Councillor Pattison quickly, and then out of the corner of my eye, Councillor Huang. Any discussion on the approval of our previous minutes? Not seeing any. I'll turn to the clerk. Shall we proceed by hand?
Yes, we shall. Sorry, I missed the mover.
Mover was Councillor Pattison, and the seconder was Councillor Huang.
Thank you very much.
We'll proceed by hand until otherwise told not to.
Yes.
All those in favor of the minutes? That's everyone. That's 7-0. It carries. Thank you. Now we're on to staff presentations. Our staff presentations at item 8, and we'll start with 8.1, the Stormwater Asset Management Investigation of Recent Sewage Leaks, and that's an Auditor's Report AUD 23010. I'd like to call up Deputy Auditor General Bridget Menard to please come to the podium to begin your presentation. There's also a consultant on hand, Jeff Reitzma, from 30 Forensic Engineering, who is here if there should be any questions. Otherwise, take it away whenever you're ready. Thank you very much. Just for committee's edification, there are 6 slides in today's presentation. We'll ask questions of the presenter, and then any discussion can happen to the rest of staff and then amongst ourselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Deputy Auditor General Bridget Menard. I'm here today to present to you the findings of the Stormwater Asset Management investigation of recent sewage leaks. Between November 2022 and February 2023, 3 wastewater spills were reported to the Public Works Committee. An order was issued by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. The Office of the Auditor General had a stormwater management audit on the 2019 to 2022 term of council work plan. This situation of wastewater spilling into the stormwater system was therefore a relevant topic of interest to our office. We did some work to gain an understanding of the relevant processes, and we retained forensic engineering experts, 30 forensic engineering, to conduct an origin and cause risk assessment investigation of the incident sewage spills and to undertake a peer review of the Hamilton Water investigation and the report by Stantec Consulting completed for Hamilton Water that responded to components of the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks order. I would like to thank Hamilton Water and the Engineering Services Division for their cooperation in this investigation, and I would also like to thank Senior Auditor Nancy Hu for being the lead auditor overseeing this project for the Office of the Auditor General. The results of the Origin and Cause Risk Assessment investigation can be found as Appendix A to Report AUD 23010. Due to the technical nature of the findings, we have with us today the professional engineer that completed this forensic work on behalf of the Office of the Auditor General. I would like to introduce you to Jeff Reitzma, Vice President and Practice Lead for Construction at 30 Forensic Engineering. Jeff will provide a summary of the investigative work that was completed. I'll now turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks. I see that there's in the chat, Brad has a question. I don't know if I'll let him maybe ask that first.
The questions will come at the end of your presentation, but thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks. And thanks very much for the introduction. So really quickly, I'll give you guys a little background about 30 Forensics. What we are a kind of a specialty engineering firm. We don't do kind of the classic design work that a Stantec or a WFP would do. We're forensic engineers. We solve problems. We look into why bad things have happened and try to understand, make sense of those investigations and understand, how can we be better? What can we learn? Maybe whose fault it was, if that's a question. And so we work a lot with the insurance and legal industries. And in this matter, we were approached by the Auditor General's office to provide some support on a technical basis and on an independent basis. And I think that's an important thing here. We don't work for the City of Hamilton to do design construction works on these kinds of things, and thus are able to maybe be a little bit more objective and ask harder questions, perhaps, in these investigations. So fundamentally, we were retained on the basis of me personally, my experience. I spent about 15 years in the wastewater industry doing design and construction work prior to becoming a forensic engineer. And over the last 10 years at 30 Forensics have been leading our remediation group, and our infrastructure investigations have predominantly been coming through my office. And so I've got an ability to speak to these issues. I've done a lot of work on wastewater systems, both in the City of Hamilton specifically and across Ontario over the course of my career. And that information, again, is inside the report. My CV is attached there. If you have questions, I'm happy to field those afterwards. So our mandate, as is shown in the slide, was to review 3 issues fundamentally. Number one, what was the origin and cause of the spill at a root, actual basis, and then to look really quickly at how was the Hamilton Water and Engineering Services, how did they respond to that collectively? Did that, meet with good practice? What other issues were relating to that may have contributed as causes, secondary causes to the spills? And then going forward, what challenges may exist to, on an ongoing basis, deal with mitigation and remediation of those issues? So those are all summarized in the report. I'm not going to belabor a lot of the background, the incident itself, insofar as the spills, the activities around that, and the nature of it happening. Those were presented to Council and this committee, I believe, quite some time ago. But we started out by having conversations with the city of Hamilton, specifically with Hamilton Water and Engineering Services. And I will say, and it's an important thing, I think, to note how cooperative those teams were, how helpful they were, how transparent they were, and seriously, interested in finding ways to be better. I think it's worth noting that there was no defensiveness. It was very open and collaborative and looking to find solutions. And all of the staff that we worked with were very helpful. So we had 4 meetings over the course of April, and we looked at, first and foremost, regarding the spill itself, the background on that, and then looking at the origin around that, specifically meeting with engineering services, looking at how the contracts are developed, how validating the deliverables from those projects are then incorporated into master documentation, and to better understand how, there was issues of the labeling of drawings, the infrastructure that was in question that was cross-connected. One of the origins of that, and we'll get to it in a moment, was that some of these lines were mislabeled. They just were the wrong. They thought it was a storm sewer, but it was actually a combined sewer. And that cross connection was a result of that. Well, how did we get to that point? And so there was an investigation and conversations around that. We spoke with the sort of asset management and drawing management teams within Hamilton Water, talking about historically how they digitized the legacy drawings prior to the sort of mid 1990s, and now going forward, how those things are managed on an ongoing basis to make sure that what's in the ground and actually built ends up being reflected in the models and drawings that are used by other parties, because that was certainly a part of the cause of this issue. And then lastly, as we was presented to this committee, one of the reasons that this was initially found was through a CCTV investigation, and someone sort of said, "Hey, that doesn't look right." That was kind of the nexus for this beginning to be unraveled and this mystery to be solved. And so, what were the processes related to those closed circuit television CCTV investigations? How do they get done? Why do they sort of find the way that they're what they find, and how are those things managed? So all of those conversations took place. I also chatted with, my network of people that I've worked with over the years in Southern Ontario and across Canada to just get an understanding of how do other municipalities and government agencies manage this? How unusual is this? To provide some context. And certainly what we can find from that is that these kinds of events, these spills of combined sewer overflow, are pretty common, probably unfortunately so. The Ministry of Environment and Conservation of Parks do publish information every year about combined sewage spills. They are very common in Canada, and part of the reason is that there's been a value decision made in Canada, certainly, around whether or not we wish to prioritize protection of hard property versus the environment. We would rather have a spill into, say, the harbor or into the lake rather than a spill into a business, into a home, or damaging a wastewater treatment plant, which may be, hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment. So there's an economic conversation that takes place there. And historically, that's been one that we have, because we have such an abundance of fresh water in Canada, and typically we're more worried from an economic perspective about protecting property and protecting people, we will allow some spills into the environment. So that's typically the value that a lot of municipalities have around this. And certainly there's a lot of pressure related to that of, where do you spend your investment dollars on infrastructure, right? And as we see climate change speaking of more and more, those kinds of investments become very difficult. Storms are getting bigger. The actual hard infrastructure to manage stormwater is difficult. And so, how do you invest in that is a difficult thing. So all that to say, that was the approach that we took. We were given a bunch of documents from the City of Hamilton. We got the Stantec report, the MECP report, and our findings fundamentally are that as follows. So number one, we know that the cause of the spill was due to this cross connection between the combined sewer and the storm sewer. That's fair enough. And that there was a design error that instructed the contractor at the time in 1996 in the original, the big spill, Hamilton, Wentworth, and Burlington, and those cross connections were not appropriate. We knew that should have been there. And then the smaller spills, there was a design issue with one of those, which again was really related to a lack of understanding of the potential for those risks, and certainly that there was not as much of a concern about that. A lot of these things back in the day were just not as worried about, but let's just get the sewage out of here. And there's a central theme here that these older combined sewer systems, which are predominantly in the sort of the historic downtown part of Hamilton, there's a lot of sewers across the region. But in Hamilton, the older part of the city, those have got these combined sewer systems because historically that was the only pipe that was there. It was a storm and a dedicated sewer. They were in the combined sewer systems. Those are all downtown, and those cross connections were quite common, those legacy approaches. It's complicated, obviously, and this is pointed out in the Stantec report, which I think is a very good report. Stantec did a really good job. There's just a lot of pipes in the city. There's over 3,000 kilometers of sewers in the city of Hamilton, and almost all, again, as I mentioned, of these combined sewer systems are in the older part of the city of Hamilton. And from a practical perspective, what we see this complexity resulting from is that the drawings have just a lot of information on them, and certainly the pre-digital drawings, when you're looking at old blueprints or scans of those old blueprints, they're hard to read. They're just physically difficult to see. The pen mark on the page, you can't zoom it in. It's not clean and crisp. There's sometimes a ring from someone's coffee cup that's sitting on the drawing, those kinds of things. They're harder to read, harder to understand. There's just a lot of stuff in the ground. And even when you know what's there, it can be hard to see physically in the ground. There's just so much stuff. And, they're dirty, they're often muddy, they're not labeled well, they're hard to see, hard to get at. So it's often difficult, even when you know what you're looking for, to find out what's there. So these kinds of cross connections are going to happen. And that's just because it's a big complex system. I talked about the legacy drawing. So that, from an origin and cost perspective, was the issue, that those cross connections took place. There are these old drawings. The city of Hamilton response, which was the second part of the mandate that we had, I will say was very good. Their response and the investigation thereof were, I would say, best in class. There were speedy resolutions. There was not a long amount of spill. The teams worked together very well from all evidence that we were presented with. And again, kudos to both Hamilton Water, Engineering Services, and their various supporting team members for a lot of hard work and good job done in responding to those spills. In response to the MECP order and the instructions, the engagement of Stantec was obviously a major part of that, and coming up with a plan and review that report. Again, there's a lot of proactive steps and the feasibility in a risk-based, solution-focused approach taken by Stantec, I think, is excellent. All of the recommendations that they make, generally speaking, I think are long-term. They're making a lot of sense, and I think they're good. In terms of systemic issues, as far as the city of Hamilton, these are, again, in the report, and there's a bunch of them. But number one, looking at the root causes, right? We've got the drawings were incorrect. This cross connection was not obvious at the time, and the drawings, the systems are complex. So keeping those three kind of origin points in mind, one of the things that is important in looking backwards, right, is, okay, number one, these connections between the combined sewers, dedicated sewers, storm sewers, all of these things, again, relate to this inherent risk-based approach, right? The city has taken the decision to protect first against basement flooding, protect against the damage to wastewater treatment facilities at Woodward Avenue specifically. And that means that overflow, if it has to happen somewhere, the city has decided that that's going to happen into the environment. And that's a value-based approach, which has been acceptable and is reasonable in terms of those things. But it is the case that that's a value-based decision. And as climate change is driving more storms, those kinds of decisions are going to come up more and more often. The city has absolutely been investing a lot of money and time and building new infrastructure to limit the amount of times that stuff overflows into the harbor, and should be commended. That investment is very difficult. It's time consuming, and on a go forward basis, those spills should decrease over time, but they're still going to be there just because there's legacy systems from the turn of the last century still that are kicking around in Hamilton. A second piece that's important to consider is the staff of the city of Hamilton and how they are available. As I said, at the outset, and it was presented to this committee, the original spill was identified just almost by happenstance, that someone was looking at a video that that just doesn't look right. So what we want to try to identify is, well, number one, why are we not having those kinds of moments more often, or how can we bake in, from a risk management perspective, more eyeballs of the right kind of person to look at these situations. And so that really relates to how Hamilton Water and Hamilton Engineering Services coordinate on construction projects, on design projects, and making sure that the right people are there. And so one of my recommendations is to try to explore more of that collaboration, making sure that you get those right eyeballs at the right time to try to have the right risk assessment. CCTV as a really powerful tool. I have no reason to suggest that they should do less of that. They should do as much of it as they can. One of the comments in the Stantec report, which I think is reasonable, is that there's just so much pipe. It would be economically impossible to really CCTV everything and identify every single little thing. So on a risk-based approach, a prioritization of these older parts of the city where we suspect there could be connections of a certain time frame, that approach is already ongoing, but that certainly is a recommendation to continue doing so, and making sure that parties from both Hamilton Water and Engineering Services are working together with the contractors engaged to do that investigation to try to look at those videos as much as possible to have more of those aha moments. The secondary piece, which is sort of related to that, is that that's going to find more problems. By looking for them, more of these problems will be found. That doesn't mean that there's more of them that are being caused. So we want to make sure that we understand that by looking for these problems, you'll find them. That doesn't mean that that's a bad thing, right? By finding them, you're solving them. And so just making sure that everyone understands that, if we just do nothing, we kind of cover our eyes, we won't notice that there's a spill, but those spills might be there. So the more work that we put into, we'll find more of those issues, but it's looking for your own problems, for lack of a better phrasing. So just from a contextual perspective, these kinds of conversations that we're having is actually very positive insofar as we're proactively trying to identify these spills. Asset management is a key piece to this, and obviously sort of central to this committee. One of the things that is inherent in the city currently is there's a multiple numbers of sort of parallel systems by department within the city. The WIM system, the IPS, SPIDER, the integration of those systems to make sure that the information to all of those parties is coordinated, is consolidated, is accurate. A lot of the steps are there in place now to make sure that those systems speak to each other, that they feed into one another in turn in an ongoing basis. An integrated system, which is sort of the holy grail of asset management, that is something that should be continued to be explored for the city, because then you'll have one stop with all that information available. And that only becomes feasible as, computing power and storage and data security, all those things are being solved. These are very complicated problems, and certainly one that every municipality and region across Canada is working towards at the same time. And then the last little point again, and there was a legacy issue. This is related more to the 1990s, the amalgamation. So the region of Hamilton, Wentworth, the city of Hamilton, and the various municipalities that now form the broader city of Hamilton, they all had their own systems at the time. And again, speaking to this data management and asset management, back in the sort of the 1990s, when this construction project, which resulted in the largest cross connection being constructed, that was at the time that amalgamation was happening. The digitization process, moving from hard blueprints and vellum drawings to digitize things, where all of that was happening at the same time. So it was almost the worst case scenario in terms of the timing of those drawings and how the accuracy of those drawings may have gotten mixed up, mislabeled. That was all happening at that time. On a go-forward basis, again, with an integrated system with very clear roles and responsibilities and ownership by Hamilton Water of all of those pipes in the ground, that makes that risk much less. But it is worth just noting that sort of having multiple hands on the same system makes it more likely that you'll have those kinds of things. So looking backwards, that was more of an issue, but going forwards, it shouldn't be. But that's sort of the last little point to this. So those are the findings of the report. I'm happy to field questions if there are any. Obviously, the report is in the appendices of the materials provided. So happy to take it forward.
Thanks. I know there's another slide in the presentation, and I'll let Deputy City Auditor Menard go through that before we get to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair Crutch. As noted by Jeff, there were 5 recommendations made to further improve Hamilton Water's operations to manage the relevant risks. Overall response to the order was appropriate, thorough, and in line with industry's best practice. That's what the findings of 30 Forensic Engineering were. Management from Hamilton Water and Engineering Services agreed with all 5 recommendations and are currently working on implementing their management responses. Our office is recommending that Council directs Hamilton Water to report back with an implementation status update by May 2024. And that's all from us today, so thank you very much.
Thank you. And before I turn to questions, just 3 quick announcements. Number 1, the electronic voting has returned. So we shall be returning to electronic voting. Number 2, the Christmas tree is being installed actively. So if you're in and around the front of the forecourt and want to see the activities, feel free. And thirdly, Councillor Mike Spadafora has arrived, and I'll just say he had fully arrived at 9:37 a.m., even though now it's 9:55, for the record. Thanks for your full arrival, and we'll take it to questions. Councillor Clark. And please let us know who you're directing the questions to, whether it be to the consultant or to Deputy City Auditor Minard.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure what that Mike Spadafora reference was all about, but the original work that was proposed really came from, if I recall correctly, Chair, a director's order from the MECP. And so the question that I have is these recommendations that are in Jeff's report. It's good to see you again, Jeff. Thank you for being here and thank you for the work. Do we know if the MECP has reviewed this material and whether or not they're pleased or happy or just boring? Not sure who's going to answer that one.
So Deputy Auditor General Bridget Menard, so I would say that's more of a question for Hamilton Water. Our office does not directly interact with the MECP, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, so I'll turn it over to Nick Winters.
Yeah, thank you. Nick Winters, Director of the Hamilton Water Division. Through you, Chair Crutch, to Councillor Clark. So the MECP, both the local office as well as others in that organization, are aware that this review was completed by the Corporate Auditor's Office. They have been, we sent them the links to the reports as soon as they were published online, as well as the presentation. I could tell you that we don't know what their impressions are of those reports, but I mean, I do talk to them regularly, and I do know that they were satisfied with the work that was done by Hamilton Water through our consultant with Stantec, and the decisions that were made by council to move forward with resourcing the programs coming out of that provincial officer's order. I will clarify that the review that was completed by the Corporate Auditor's Office here was not part of those provincial officer's orders. And so the completion of this presentation and report were not linked to completing the action items under those provincial officers' orders either.
Thank you for that, Mr. Winters. That's very helpful. I'm looking at, Chair, page 4 or 5 in Appendix B. And it talks about establishing a process for public sector data collection standards so that all stakeholders undertaking CCTV sewer inspection capture and record the data in this IPC data collection system. So can I dig into this a little bit, Chair? Is it the expectation that at some point in the future there'll be a bylaw that requires plumbers and the folks that do these inspections that if they do an inspection on sewer pipes, that they share that information with the city? Is that what the intention is?
So through you, Chair Crutch, to Councillor Clark, that's not the intention. But for the sake of extreme accuracy, I've got Director McCauley to my right here. I'll ask him to respond to this one. We also have Director Kennedy. She is on the virtual meeting as well.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning. Thank you. Shane McCauley, Director of Water Wastewater Operations. Through the chair, the purpose of this recommendation really is about when our corporate asset management team is out doing CCTV inspections of our sewer system and capturing that data into our work order management system and our asset management system. And that is work that is being done. I believe you're referring to plumbers and internal piping and cross connections at the individual home basis. And that is work that is being done through our cross connection control program today and will continue to be expanded through the new inspection program.
Chair, may I ask a supplemental question?
Go for it.
Thank you. I'm looking at page 4 or 5 again, and I'm sorry, Shane, I'm not trying to cause any problems here, but I don't understand the paragraph. It says develop and establish a process, and then it says so that all stakeholders undertaking CCTV sewer inspection capture and record the data. In your response to my question, you talked about Hamilton Water employees. What does stakeholders mean on this page? Who are the stakeholders?
Through the chair, thank you very much. Sorry, appreciate the clarification. The stakeholders here referring to the internal city departments. So between engineering services, they undertake CCTV inspection for condition assessments. Hamilton Water, we undertake a number of CCTV inspections looking for cross connections. We may be CCTVing looking for blockages in the sewers. And so there's a number of internal departments that will do that work. And what this recommendation is, making sure that we have a process that all of that information gets into a centralized asset management system so that we all have access to that data and that we're making decisions based on that data.
So if that is the case, and I'm always looking at these things, someone's going to be reading this 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Would we not be better off removing the term stakeholders and then put in I forget the terminology used, internal something or other. Stakeholders, when I read it, stakeholders has a specific definition. I mean, it's people that we're dealing with in government at the municipality, and it has a wide breadth, but I'm not sure that's what the intention was here. Or maybe it was. I don't know. It was yeah, it was the city's response to the recommendation. So I'm just wondering if there's a better way of describing stakeholders.
Through the chair, I understand where you're coming from. I appreciate that. It might be easiest if we were to clarify that when we come back with our updated report in May. The report is there, the recommendations are there. We understand where you're coming from, and we'll be happy to update that and clarify that when we come back with our report, if that's helpful.
Most certainly, Chair, and that's completely acceptable to me. Thank you, everybody, for the work on this. It was very important that we get this done. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and I see no further speakers on our list at the moment. Oh, emergence. Councillor Taddison.
I just wrote some notes down as you're speaking to the consultant, Jeff. Jeff, you said we had a best-in-class response. Can you basically summarize that in like 3 or 4 sentences?
I'll do my best. I mean, I think looking at it from the perspective of the actual spill events themselves,
Yes.
So I think number one, it was well documented. Number two, the speed of the resolution. So to number one, stop the spill from continuing and making reconnections in the appropriate manner in all 3 cases was done very quickly. And then those events were, again, shared and initiating these further activities. There was never any attempt, there's no evidence of any kind that there was not treating this with the utmost of priority by any of the parties, and engaging all the personnel across Hamilton Water and Engineering Services to make sure that the right people were there to help solve it right off the top. So that at very high level, that would be what I mean by that.
And that's the level I wanted, so thank you very much. Can I direct to, is this the time when we ask staff, or is that for later?
Well, we'll wait till the presenters are done the
Perfect.
presentation. We
Thank
can
you.
ask staff additional questions if it's okay. Not seeing any other hands leaping up. At this time, we'll move to receive the presentation. Can I have a mover and seconder to do so? It's Councillor Spatafor and Councillor Alex Wilson. And we'll go to the now electronic vote. And that vote's up. And that vote carries 8-0. And thanks very much to the presenters. And Jeff, if you don't mind just sticking around in case there's magically a question that comes back to you through this process, that'd be helpful. Otherwise, turn it over to Councillor Taddison with some questions for staff. Go ahead, Councillor Taddison.
Just a question to,
Pardon me, sorry to interrupt. Mr. Chair, can we have a mover and seconder to put the report on the floor first?
You can't ask questions, Mark, until we actually do the job of putting it on the floor. Sorry, that's my fault. Moved by Councillor Taddison, seconded by Councillor Alex Wilson. We'll motion to put that on the floor. And now, Councillor Taddison, you can proceed.
question for Director Nick Winters. Director, again, we just heard that it was a world-class first-rate response. Can I get an understanding of who all the stakeholders are in that response that was done?
Yeah, certainly. Through you, Chair Kretsch, to Councillor Taddison. So it was a pretty broad response. Thinking back to almost a year ago when we discovered this first cross-connected sewer. A number of sections within Hamilton Water, certainly. Our operational teams that were out doing the inspections, our compliance team that assists us both with laboratory analysis, with corresponding with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, who is our regulator. They also do our own spills investigation program. They were involved. Director Kennedy's team with engineering services, specifically the infrastructure renewal section within her shop, they would have been involved in helping us review the scope of the proposed repair for really all three of these spills that we had identified over the course of about a 6-month period, starting with the initial spill at Burlington and Wentworth, followed by our pilot inspection program where we discovered the other two. The Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks certainly was involved, with us reporting these discharges in a timely manner and cooperating with their investigations as part of this. Certainly in this case, involving the corporate auditor team based on the direction of Mayor Horvath and the senior leadership team. And there was a ton of communications surrounding these events, starting with the first event that was discovered, again, just about a year ago. So Director Grant's team, from a communications perspective, was also heavily involved to make sure that we were doing everything that was needed with communication, both to council, but also to our communities as well. And I see that Director Kennedy has her hand up there on the screen.
Thank you, Nick. Jackie Kennedy, Director of Engineering Services. I just want to make sure that my survey team does not get overlooked. They were part of the response too in identifying the exact particulars of the locations and the very detailed measurements that they take with their skills. So I just want to make sure they're included in that response. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that very wholesome answer. And can I just understand the pilot inspection team? Who compromises, or who's that built from?
Certainly, through you, Chair Kretsch. So the pilot risk-based inspection program, that was entirely within Hamilton Water and within our water distribution and wastewater collection section specifically. So Manager Dave Alberton oversees that program, and it included really our wastewater collection operators going out and conducting those risk-based inspections. There was certainly, some of Dave's leadership team within that section who helped to identify the areas for the risk-based inspection and set the program. But after that, it was really our frontline team who were going out and doing those physical inspections over a period of about 4.5 months to get through our pilot program.
Thank you, Director. No more questions.
Thanks, Councillor Taddison. I don't see any further speakers on the list for questions of staff. Any comments anybody want to make about the report before we go to the vote? I see Councillor Alex Wilson and Councillor Maureen Wilson. Councillor Alex Wilson, take it away.
Thank you. I just did want to say thanks for this. I think we have a duty to help communicate this as well. When we were hearing earlier about the consultant, I think a lot of the times we hear from public, well, why isn't it just done? Or especially hearing that, well, it's all a value-based decision in terms of where an overflow goes. And I think hearing that, I know there's folks in Ward 13 and other places in the city who are going, well, let's have different values then. And I think it's so important. And I think this conversation today, Hamilton Water, our entire team has been quite consistent in helping fill the gaps and saying, we agree. And it was part of changing those values that involves looking at all of our infrastructure, understanding the system we have and making those changes. Really appreciative of the response and as we're going. And I think that the comments earlier, I just want to echo is when we look for problems, we will find them. That doesn't mean they're not there today. And so just really grateful that we're continuing this work. I don't think we're necessarily advancing anything particularly new today, so much as kind of receiving some of that, continuing on track. And so just want to say thanks to all this great work that is going on. I think we are slowly getting there and surely getting there. And interested in also conversations about how to accelerate this work as well. But we're definitely on a different path, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thanks. And Councillor Alex Wilson, over to you, Councillor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you. Similarly, very appreciative of this work, very appreciative of the management responses and the opportunity, the continuous opportunity that this affords us to include the community in these value sets, that it is our ultimately a community responsibility. And I know that Director Winters and his team just thorough, dogged, professional in including the community in those discussions, and looking forward to those choices and those discussions about values as we move forward, and very, very appreciative of the leadership that has been shown here. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Maureen Wilson. I don't see any further speakers on this item, so we will go to the vote now on the recommendations in the report. And that vote's up. And that carries 8-0. And we're now on to item 8.2, the Fraud and Waste Annual Report. And this will be delivered by the city's Auditor General, Charles Brown, who's coming down to the podium. It's report AUD 23011. For those curious, there are about 16 slides in this presentation, and whenever you're ready and they're set up, Auditor Brown, go for it.
Thank you. Through you, I'm Charles Brown, Auditor General, and I'm joined by Deputy Auditor General Bridget Menard to present our annual fraud and waste report, the fourth such report since we started the fraud and waste hotline. The purpose of this report is to provide an overview of all the whistleblower fraud and waste matters that came to our attention during the period from July 2022 to June 2023. As you know, the hotline is an independently run, confidential 24/7 service where the general public and employees of the city can report suspicions of wrongdoing or make complaints about government waste. By encouraging them to report their concerns, it can help the city to improve operations and build trust and confidence in city government. You may recall that Earlier this year, Council gave its approval for making the hotline permanent and authorized our office to negotiate contract renewal with the existing provider of hotline services. The previous contract ran for 4 years at a fixed annual cost of $12,500. Under the new arrangement, we agreed to pay a fixed annual price of $14,750 for 3 years, with the option of extending for 2 more years at modest increases. Council also directed that we use funds previously approved until exhausted, so there will be no impact on the tax operating budget until 2025. So we have some statistics to go over. As has happened every year since the inception, we see an increase in the volume. I'm going to ask Bridget Menard to just cover some of the statistics that we encountered this year with our audits. Bridget?
Great, thanks so much, Charles. So in the current reporting period, 159 reports were received. I will note this is a 49% increase from the prior reporting period, which had 107. So that is a significant year-over-year increase. The substantiation rate was 31%. The previous 2 reporting periods were 32%, so this is remaining fairly consistent. We do have a higher rate of substantiation than Ottawa and Toronto, but overall we find that the rate is reasonable. The substantiation rate is calculated as the percentage of reports that were partially or fully substantiated that were received in the current reporting period, plus any carry-forward cases that were resolved. In-progress cases are excluded from this calculation and are included in the reporting period where the case is closed. Moving on to top report categories. The top report category in this reporting period was multiple categories applicable. So what that means is that there were multiple items from the list below typically that were all included in that one report that was received. Having this being the top category is indicative of the complexity of the reports that our office is receiving. These types of reports typically contain multiple allegations across a wide variety of topics. I will note that there was a jump in employee benefits fraud cases this year, and there continues to be conflict of interest reports received. Other top categories of reports include social services. These typically relate to Ontario Works and Housing Services. And the service complaints and concerns categories spans a wide range of city service areas. Moving on to the statistics of employee reports, 48% of the reports received by the Fraud and Waste Hotline were self-identified to be an employee, with the remaining 52% being from the members of the public. Our office does find that this percentage varies from year to year. In the prior reporting period, 64% of reporters self-identified as a City of Hamilton employee. Moving on to direct versus proxy reports. So of these reports, 53 reports were made directly to the Office of the Auditor General. We refer to these as proxy reports. The remainder were made using our hotline service provider, which was about 2/3 of the reports. For those 1/3 of reports that were received directly by our office, close to half of those reports were from management, human resources, and finance. These are folks that understand that they have an obligation to report fraud and waste matters to our office. So it's a good thing that there is such a high number of reports that are coming in from finance, human resources, and procurement. So that's a good thing overall. So what did we do with those 159 reports? Overall, a total of 13 investigations were launched by the Office of the Auditor General, all for current period reports. What kind of investigations were undertaken? We undertook 2 fraud investigations, 3 combined waste and mismanagement investigations, and 5 combined fraud and waste or mismanagement investigations, along with 3 whistleblower investigations. We also referred 35 items to management for their review and investigation, with a report back required to the Office of the Auditor General. There were another 35 items where the item was out of jurisdiction, did not contain enough information, or did not require a response by the Office of the Auditor General. There are 4 items in progress where the final approach is still being determined by our team. Now that I've told you what the approach was for those reports, you might wonder, what was the outcome? Of the 176 reports that were handled, that includes the 159 reports I just discussed, plus 17 reports from prior reporting periods that remained in progress. The outcome was that we had 33 reports that were substantiated, 11 partially substantiated, 22 unsubstantiated, 35 reports remain open and in progress, which is typical because some reports require a significant amount of time to fully investigate. And then other ones, 75, had a status of not applicable. Those are typically things that were not in scope for the fraud and waste hotline, a direct referral to another agency. We provide a lot of referrals to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre or the Ontario Ombudsman if it's not truly a matter of fraud and waste. So that's what that would typically include. Continuing on with discussing outcomes, Human Resources informed our office that there were 9 terminations and 9 other actions taken, consisting of 5 resignations, 1 other where no rehire status was provided for a city employee that had retired, 2 non-disciplinary letters were issued, and 1 instance where discipline was issued. Overall, $132,000 worth of loss or waste or mismanagement was substantiated since our last fraud and waste annual report, which came to Audit, Finance and Administration Committee in February, a little later than typical because of the municipal election that took place last October. We also had $2,600 worth of losses recovered. Unfortunately, recoveries are typically a tiny % of losses incurred by an organization. So while this number may seem small, it is quite typical. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, they publish their annual report to the nations, and it is very consistent to have a very small percentage of recoveries. Overall, $1.287 million in lost or waste has been substantiated since the hotline launch. This is our 4th annual report, so that number spans 4 years, 4 12-month reporting periods. And the cumulative losses recovered since the hotline launch was just under $36,000. I'll now pass it back to Charles.
Thank you, Bridget. So as is our practice in previous report, this report contains brief summaries of the more significant complaints that we investigated, and I'll briefly describe some of them. In one case, we substantiated that there were 3 employees that had conflicts of interest with a contractor providing services to the city, conflicts that were the result of having a significant social relationship, including receiving hospitality from the contractor and attending social gatherings together in a non-business setting. We also concluded the contractor received favorable treatment from these employees. We received information about a plans examiner that was charged with breach of trust. We launched an investigation, but much of the work is delayed pending a trial, which has started, but is not expected to finish until next year. We substantiated an allegation that an employee was taking money under the table from a group of users of a city sports facility. There were 10 employees investigated, all substantiated, for making false claims for health benefits. 6 of these were investigated by our office, and these resulted in approximately $31,000 in loss. The other 4, nearly $13,000. As a result of these instances, we've decided to launch an audit of benefits administration to see if there are any systemic issues and improvements that could be made. The city was targeted by an imposter vendor who managed to change the banking information on file with city for the real vendor. Over $52,000 in monies owed to the real vendor were diverted to the imposter. We substantiated an anonymous complaint about a full-time city employee that during the same period of time, which was during COVID, was working full-time at another city. We received a complaint about procurement processes not being followed in the awarding of a sole source contract to a consulting company owned by a recently retired employee. Although no rules were violated, we did find that the city policies are silent on this particular situation. There were 2 reports of abuse of short-term disability that were investigated by Human Resources and substantiated. We received a report of an employee committing various wrongdoings, including theft and stealing of customers' payment card and substance abuse. We investigated the payment card issue and found it to be substantiated. In another case, we substantiated information we received about an employee doing similar work for an employer in the private sector, the duties of which would conflict with their role in the city. In a case referred to Human Resources, it was confirmed that an employee used a city corporate account at a building supply store to make fraudulent purchases of approximately $1,400. And lastly, we investigated an employee allegedly living in a vacant city-owned housing unit without the knowledge of management, and also making modifications to the unit at city expense for their personal benefit. It was alleged that another employee responsible for oversight of the unit knew about and didn't report it, and both allegations were substantiated. So these were the main cases, and as we typically do in the front section of our report, we have noted a few of the more significant or emerging themes of this year's activity, and that includes a significant number of false benefit claims. So as I explained, we'll be launching an audit of benefits administration. Conflicts of interest that continue to be a recurring issue since I think at least the past 2 previous reports. Poor contract administration and oversight is another theme. And of course, the need to be vigilant with respect to these phishing scams, which seemingly happen on a daily basis. Attempts, that is. One other item to draw your attention to is related to our budget. If you recall, our office brought forward a request for an additional FTE to help respond to the growing volume of fraud and waste complaints and reduce the impact on our audit plan. And a recommendation was made and approved to refer that to the 2024 budget process. I'm well aware of Council's challenges with this year's budget pressures, and in light of these circumstances, we carefully considered the message and direction coming from Council to reflect on such requests with due regard to Council priorities and impact on residents. So we are recommending that a referral, the referral to budget 2024 for that requested FTE be deferred to the 2025 budget. Now, I understand this morning I was told there's perhaps a procedural issue with making that recommendation today. I can't explain that, but perhaps you can explain.
No worries, I'll do that when it comes time to. We're not quite there yet.
Okay. So just drawing that to your attention. I'm sorry I didn't know that till this morning. So that's our presentation. We stand ready for questions.
Great, and I'd ask if we could do either a split screen or take the presentation down so we can see the speakers. And on the speakers list is Councillor Huang, and then I'm on the speakers list for Councillor Huang. Go ahead, Councillor Huang.
Thank you, Chair. I am glad to hear this report. I wanted to understand the top report categories, of which you named the #1 category as multiple categories applicable. Does that mean that the multiple categories applicable, given that you are spending more time on investigating all of this, those are mostly in the substantiated category then? So essentially what I'm saying is, if the complaint comes in as more complex, is there a higher likelihood of it being substantiated?
So through the chair, thank you, Councillor, for that question. I would need to go back to our underlying data, and I can run those numbers and perhaps provide an overall email to Audit, Finance and Administration Committee members. I don't have that in front of me this morning. I think multiple categories applicable, so I'll use one of the case examples that Charles discussed. So regarding the allegations that were substantiated regarding the use of a city-owned housing unit. So for that one I believe it was, off the top of my head, I believe it was a multiple categories applicable because, for example, there would have been waste and mismanagement concerns relating to the modifications that were made to the unit, and then also for the its improper use of city assets, which would broadly fall under misconduct. So as you can, and misappropriation of city assets. You can see how for one case that we've described, there's likely two or three categories. I'm sorry, that's the best I can do without having all the stats in front of me. But yeah, they're typically complex. Those ones, it depends. Some of them do take quite a lot of time, but for others, we do our preliminary assessment and we find that perhaps no further work is needed. So for example, if somebody makes allegations about a city employee, one of the first things that we do check is that individual a city employee. If not, that would likely stop us from moving forward because we only handle matters relating to City of Hamilton operations. So if we just receive a random name, we wouldn't proceed any further. So it does depend on each situation. Each case received is unique.
Thank you. Follow up.
Just to add to that, it's worth noting that a lot of times we get one complaint about one issue, but then once we get in there and investigate, we find other issues. So that's going to naturally fall into that category.
Okay, thank you. In that very case that you actually outlined, I do read that the employees were terminated, but did that generate additional protocols from all of the other departments in order to shore up that potential gap so in that way something like this doesn't happen again?
So through the chair to the councillor, what I would say is if you take a look at Appendix A, there is a more detailed description of that particular situation. It is on page 26 of 30 to Appendix A. So overall, we did find issues that also include improper cash handling and mishandling of confidential client files. $9,900 of waste was substantiated. We also did make 15 recommendations, such as regular unannounced checks on city assets, better tracking and inventory management, adequate segregation of duties, and many more. So we did make those recommendations at the time the investigation report was issued to ensure that management was fully aware of how to remedy the issues identified in the investigation reports.
Perfect. Thank you. Back to that slide that was top report categories. Could you give us an example of other various categories? Because there's 12. What does that mean?
Oh, the 12 categories?
Yeah.
So that could be various categories. I would think of waste, because we've got all the. These are more a list of waste generally, but issues of process violations and compliance issues, and that would be one area. What else, Bridget?
So there's an example in Appendix A where, towards the back of it, where it talks about fraudulent apartment vacancy ads. So that is something that does not necessarily relate to city operations or a city service. So we occasionally receive these one-offs, and it's not easily inserted into one of those categories. So it truly is like the kitchen sink of all categories. It could be everything from a fraudulent apartment vacancy ad to, the last example, there was concerns about a heritage tree. It would be those types of unusual items that are not otherwise easily put into a category.
Thank you, Chair. Last question is that in addition to these, like the kitchen sink of all categories, are we keeping a historical record? Because what if we are getting more fraudulent vacancy ads as the time goes on, and then ultimately it becomes like a bigger issue? So are we keeping a historical record of these kitchen sink categories?
Sure. So through the chair to the councillor, we do keep meticulous records. We have all of our records for every single case that was received, and we do data analysis of that. And every case reported back to our office. So, for example, that apartment vacancy ad that had nothing to do with a city-owned apartment, so it's not really in our scope at all, we would have provided a referral to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, or perhaps provided a referral to how to file a report with the Hamilton Police Service. So we try to provide assistance to people who might not necessarily have awareness of various other avenues for how to file a report that's relating to fraud that does not relate to City of Hamilton operations.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Yeah, one of the things to be aware of is that these investigations sometimes not only result in a memo being issued to make improvements, but when the issue arises, as you suggest, something that we see happen frequently over and over again, that will cause us to launch perhaps an audit of looking for systemic issues. And that's the reason we have the themes. Every year we've had a sort of themes that are emerging. So we're very careful to look for those things coming up in the following year.
Thanks, Councillor Huang. We've now had some further speakers added to our list. Councillor Taddison, Councillor Maureen Wilson. Up next, Councillor Taddison.
I'm not sure if I should take this question offline. I'm just trying to understand the difference between the direct versus proxy. I understand the one's a phone call hotline, but what's the process for a proxy report? What does management go through, or finance or human resources, to make one of those reports?
Sure. So through the chair to the councillor, that's a really great question. So ultimately, all reports that are received go into our case management system. That's the system that is provided by our hotline provider. A proxy report, a really good example would be, for example, if human resources identified a benefits fraud issue, or if somebody in finance identified a cash handling issue, a lot of times folks will email or call staff in the Office of the Auditor General, and we'll do an intake interview with them, just same as our third-party provider would do, but it's done by Office of the Auditor General staff, and then we'll enter that case into our case management system. It's just a different entry point, but all of them receive that preliminary assessment. So we just like to provide the statistics, because overall, like I said before, it's a really good thing when folks in finance, procurement, HR are proactively reaching out to our office if they have any concerns about fraud or waste, and they are actually required to. There's a council-approved fraud policy and protocol, so it's very common for us to have those proxy reports. Sometimes members of the public will call or email us. Our details are published on our website, so some folks just feel more comfortable doing that than using the formal hotline service. There's no wrong door. However, people get in touch with us, we are happy to do the intake.
Thanks for that clarification.
Thanks, Councillor Taddison. Councillor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. I'll have the same question for staff following your presentation. It is concerning to hear about poor contract administration and oversight emerging as a, I think your words, frequent issue. So just so that I'm clear, could you just outline for me your findings, your reports, and how they affect corporate admin and practice, because there's no management? Or could you just comment on how your work is informing or changing, or how you track whether it's affecting contract admin?
So through the chair, when we see such, as I said, when we see such poor practices going on, we'll typically issue a memo to management. In this case, I think the contract management issues started for us, if you remember Greitmeyer. That was a significant report, and it opened our eyes to, you know, our ability as a city to have keen oversight of any work that someone does for the city, including managing vendors and they're not delivering on their work. So this is an issue that emerged in some of our cases that we're tracking, and I think you'll hear more about, because we are engaged now in an audit of, for example, of transfer payments. And we'll be coming back to this committee with the results of that audit, but it has sparked yet another audit to look for how we oversee those types of situations. Another one that you will see hopefully in January, which again carries that same theme, is an audit of how we administer real estate leases and licenses. So as I say, what we do with, I'm just letting you know what the themes that are emerging, but the actions that we take as a result typically would be, if we start seeing systemic issues, we'll launch an audit, and that way you'll have the benefit of seeing particular issues that are more systemic in nature, but obviously then you'll have the benefit of the management responses that come with those particular reports.
Thank you. On your recommendation that you were seeking to put forward about the budget, I don't know if it's in order for me to ask this question. My understanding would be that is within the domain of council to make that decision during those deliberations. And it would probably be more appropriate for me, Chair, to ask the question at that time. Your recommendation is, you framed it as one of being fiscally thoughtful, as opposed to speaking to whether or not the need exists. And I guess I'm kind of confused. Is your recommendation one because you're being fiscally thoughtful to the real budget deliberation dilemma, if you will, that we're facing, or is it you don't think you need it at this time?
I think we're recommending it because I think we can get by another year.
All right. I'll look forward to that discussion during budget time.
Fully staffed up. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. You took the question. I'll hand the chair to Councillor Huang. That was a question I was going to also ask Councillor Morgan-Wilson, was about that position. What this audit department is doing is, I think, a lot of important work. My question for you is around a comment you made in the report that I want to just sort of drill down into, and then I'll have some comments afterwards. And bear with me a moment as I find the comment. There it is. It's on page 24 of 30 of Appendix A to report AUD 23011. And it's specifically with respect to the hiring of former employees via sole source procurement. And I guess the bit I'm missing from this context here is where you had previously stated things like, oh, this was substantiated, or this wasn't substantiated. I understand that you're doing that based on its interaction with the policy, right? Substantiation, I understand maybe you're using that word when it reflects an official policy, but I guess I'm not seeing here is, it was alleged that proper procurement processes were not followed when a sole source contract was awarded to a consultant company that is owned by a recently retired employee. All you said is that it was the policies were silent, but you didn't say whether or not it was substantiated. Was that true? Did that happen or not?
So the allegation was not substantiated because the allegation was that this was did not follow proper process. So in a technical sense, that was not substantiated. It followed the proper process. What we're saying is that there is no process for this situation, other than the procurement policy 11 process, which was followed in this case. So it did go through the proper process, but just simply following procurement pursuant to meeting the requirements of policy 11 doesn't speak to this issue of the hiring of former employees. So there's a gap. For example, if you hire an employee back as a temporary staff person, there's a process for that. But if you hire the same employee through hiring them as a consultant, there's no process for that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. This highlights a similar gap in other parts of our hiring for the organization when it comes to counselors' offices. So I'm glad that you're working with Human Resources to recommend process improvements. Can you speak to that and speak to what you know happening in comparative municipalities? And I'll make it even easier by saying there's a certain cooling off period often the other corporations use when it comes to these kinds of situations. When an employee quits, is fired, or retires from a job, there's often a cooling off period where they're not allowed to sort of engage in business with the municipality again. Is this something you've witnessed elsewhere? What does it mean when it says the OAG, or the Office of the Auditor General, is currently working with Human Resources to recommend process improvements? What are those process improvements you're looking to recommend? If you could speak more to that, I would appreciate it.
So that's exactly what we're talking about. I'm aware of other cities that have policies related to former employees, retired employees that come back and work for whatever government agency there is. So our response was to send a memo to HR and make our recommendations that this process be reviewed, looking at other municipalities, for example, so that this gap could be addressed. Because I think for any former or retired employee, I guess, coming back to work for the city, if we took the time to set up a process for them, and I think the cooling off period, I think, is 13 weeks, if you come back as a temporary staff person, why doesn't that same logic apply if you simply incorporate or put up your shingle as a consultant?
Thanks very much for answering those questions. I don't see any other speakers in the speakers this time for questions for the presenters. Thank you so much. I've thusly received the chair back from Councillor Huang via magic, and appreciate that. And we will now vote on receiving the presentation. And you can return to your seats, and thank you very much for your time.
We do need a mover and a seconder, Mr. Chair.
Well, that's nice. Councillor Huang, who wants to second it? Councillor Spadafora. And we'll go to the vote. The vote is up. That carries 8-0. And now we turn to questions of staff, if there are any. I have one. Councillor Maureen Wilson also has indicated. So Councillor Maureen Wilson, sorry, on the report, but we need a mover and seconder to put the report on the floor.
You do need a mover and a seconder to put a report on the floor, and then I believe Councillor Clark has an amendment.
Oh, I forgot about the amendment. Thank you so much. Doing an excellent job today, everyone. Thanks for your patience. So I need a mover and seconder. The mover will be Councillor Tattison, and the seconder will be Councillor Huang. And now we can have questions. Before we get there, Councillor Clark has an amendment to the report. I just want to flag this just for simplicity purposes. The amendment is part of the amendment for B is out of order simply because it's a council decision that was made. In order to change that decision that we made, we have to go to council. So we will not speak to that today here at the Audit, Finance, and Administration Committee. We have no power over that. But beyond that, Councillor Clark has an amendment. I'll entertain questions first before we get to the amendment, if it's okay. Or should we amend the report first? You decide, Clerk Bates.
As long as the questions are, so the amendment is to remove item B, to amend the report to remove subsection B. So you'll be just, you can have that discussion, discuss the report without the amendment and amend it at the end if you'd like. It's really not material.
Okay. So we'll start with questions from Councillor Maureen Wilson, and then I saw Councillor Chattison's hand, and then myself. Of staff, go ahead.
Yep, thank you, Chair. I just have a small question on the theme of cooling off and the use of, pardon me, but does that policy apply to elected officials following their service? Through the chair.
So through the chair, Laura Fontana, Executive Director of Human Resources. I'd have to refamiliarize myself with the policy, but I would say no, because elected officials, for all intents and purposes, are not considered employees of the city. So that would negate their, the scope of councillors within that policy.
Thank you, through the chair. And unfair question, but is that the case for other elected officials who are in service at other levels of government? Do you know that? Or would that be, maybe you could get back to us?
Through the chair, I wouldn't, I'll review it and respond via email to this committee. I'm not familiar. It would be outside the scope of the city in terms of, the councillors and the employment relationship. But I suspect that would be the same case.
Thank you. And just a small question on, it's an operational matter. My understanding is that when a member of council decides not to run again, or they're defeated, they have the option of, I think, buying or taking their own, like their city cell phone and all the contact information with them, is, which is a discussion in and of itself. Is that the same that applies to a city employee? Through the chair.
Through the chair, it is. It happens rarely, and it is something that our IT division is reviewing, and will come back with some proposed changes with respect to that policy with that IT security lens. So effectively, I'm messaging, we will likely be recommending further restrictions with respect to allowing for former employees or elected officials from continuing to inherit those devices.
That's good to hear. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Tattison, did you have a question? No, nope, I made that up. Councillor Clark.
So to Councillor Maureen Wilson's question, Chair, did I hear Mr. Zagarek correctly that we will be prohibiting the sale of these phones to staff or councillors at the end of their contracts? And the reason I'm asking is MFIPA is pretty clear that information that's on that phone is only on that phone while we're conducting our business at the city. So it's not meant for someone to take it with them and utilize it for, I don't know, contract work or whatever the case is.
Through the chair, apologize. I should have first introduced myself previously. Mike Zagarek, General Manager of Finance Corporate Services. It's best for us to come back with IT staff to speak to the practice. It is my understanding these devices are wiped. what is often requested is that the phone numbers are retained and that individuals are wanting to continue to have that connectivity through the phone number of that device. But again, we will report back with respect to that practice. And again, the interest is to ensure that the security of the city's networks as well as data and information.
Thank you, Chair.
Illuminating. I'll pass the chair to Councillor Huang, and I have a couple of questions, a comment if it's okay, and come to comments in a moment. But over the course of the last year, I've run into too many situations at this committee where the answer to the question was, yeah, that applies to city staff, but doesn't apply to city councillors. The gap, in my opinion, is huge in terms of the kinds of policies we're subjected to and the kinds of policies that are reasonable for city staff to follow. And while I understand that we're not, for all intents and purposes, city staff or city employees, there's an ethicality behind why we're having these policies for city employees. The question I'm asking you, this is rhetorical slightly, is why the ethicality doesn't apply to us. But what I want to ask you is, and I talked about this last year, said I'll bring a request or a motion for it at the appropriate time. It's feeling more inappropriate as the days pass. Maybe Councillor Maureen Wilson and I can work on something, but what would it take in terms of getting a report like that back about what the gaps are and how we close those gaps? Because it makes me deeply uncomfortable on a regular basis to have a kind of, these are my words, kind of Wild West operation on one side of the organization and not on the other. So how can we close the gaps here? What does it look like? What's the best mechanism? Should it go to governance? Committee review? Like, if you could advise me, I'd appreciate it so I can draft something appropriate.
Perhaps E.D. Fontana?
Yeah, thank you through the chair. Thanks for the question, Councillor. I would suggest that we take direction from the committee to do an exhaustive review of our policies. Some apply, some not, but I take your point about what applies to council and what doesn't apply in that connection as an employee or not an employee of the corporation. We have done sort of a comparable analysis when it comes to the code of conduct, one for members of council, one for city employees. We can undertake the same exercise when it comes to city policies and procedures and identify some of the gaps and bring forward recommendations to basically eliminate those gaps.
Councillor?
Thanks, and I assume we could, at that time, for posterity, attach the same report you did for the Code of Conduct and have a holistic conversation about all that at one time, about where the gaps exist between employees and elected officials, where it makes sense to close those gaps and where it doesn't, so that all of council can have an informed discussion about that. Because I think at this point, without that analysis of a table of showing us where those disparities are, it becomes a one-off conversation we keep having. That we keep having. So does that make sense? And should it come here or should it go to governance?
E.D. Fontana?
So through the chair, it's anticipated that the code of conduct is going back to the governance, so I would suggest that this one comes back. We can combine the two matters and bring a wholesome report to governance committee.
Councillor?
LC Bates is interested.
If you're going to, through the chair, recommend that this new report back be added to that, it would be best to have an amendment at council to amend that original recommendation that originated from governance, the governance report. So it would be AFNA report, something from the summer. So we can take that back and help prepare an amending motion at council if a member would like to do that.
Being a member, I'd like to do that if we could, and thank you for taking that up offline to help with that work. I'd like to get a comprehensive report so that we have a gap analysis done of all the areas where we feel we could use the benefit of closing those gaps.
So, Councillor, you're going to take that offline. You're going to work with Elsie Bates on that, and then come to the next AFA before it gets ratified at the next council.
No, we'll go right to council probably on November 22nd.
Okay.
And I'll look to my colleagues for their thoughts on that if they have any now
Okay.
or later. But thanks, and I'm not in possession of my email at this moment, so I rely on you, thankfully, to follow up with that. Appreciate it. And if Councillor Wilson is willing to second that still, if you could copy her on that correspondence, I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you. On that note, I'll take back the chair. Any other comments on the annual fraud and waste report? Oh, pardon me. I see that E.D. Fontana wanted to speak.
Sorry.
No, it's
sorry
okay,
to
by
you,
all means. That's
to
what the
you,
microphone's
Chair.
for.
We're just reviewing the spreadsheet of all of our outstanding work plan, and it would appear that this work is flowing through audit, finance, and admin.
Oh.
So perhaps we just bring everything back to AFNA.
Sure. Okay.
We've just confirmed that on our work plan, that it was coming back to this committee.
I see. So should we make it for the next AFNA meeting then? Is that okay?
So to the report back to the next AFNA, is that, I don't know if that's,
No, sorry. The amendment that we were talking about making to the report, would we do that today or we do that at the next AFNA meeting?
so no, the amendment would still need to be done at council.
Okay.
Because that decision has already been made by council.
Okay.
And so it will just be a report instead of reporting back to governance. I believe the point is that it's reporting back to AFNA instead of governance.
Oh, thank you for the clarification, which I obviously missed. Thank you. Appreciate that very much. I'm not seeing other comments, so I'm going to pass the chair back to Councillor Huang. We're going to have a lot of fun today. And I wanted to make some comments about the annual fraud and waste report. So we saw this report last year and was one of the very first reports that, as chair of this committee, we saw. And I have to say, and I want to really say this publicly, I'm really glad for what I consider to be some breathtaking transparency in this. It was difficult to read that report, frankly, especially the part which summarized the different things that you discovered along the way, the different kinds of fraud and different kinds of waste that you discovered. None of us want to see that happening. We don't want to see employees doing that, but what I'm seeing is there's a huge increase and a huge uptake in two areas. One, we're seeing more proxy reports, meaning internally, people are starting to actually report these things, and we're getting a lot of reports. That the additional staff that your office has had is giving you a greater capacity, obviously, to also take in these reports. We have a ton coming in from hotlines, and we're still finding reports coming in from city staff. So those things are all really positive, and I just want to shine a light on that because as tough as it is to hear these things, the sooner we start to actually address those things and be transparent about how we're addressing them, the more we help the public have faith in what we're doing here. A lot of times, I think in the past, some of these things may have been resolved, but we may not have had this kind of transparency about the resolutions, about what it means, and we certainly didn't normalize the conversations around these things. As time goes on, I'm hoping that we'll see less fraud and waste, obviously, but I think just having the discussion in public is good. I appreciate the work of the Office of the Auditor General and everything you've done to try and make your operations transparent and more holistic. I am a little saddened that we're having the conversation about not giving your office additional support that it may need to do this work. It's obviously not for right now, but I'm just saying that it's on my mind. And on that, I'll take the chair back, and I will go to Councillor Clark for the amendment.
Thank you, Chair. It's an amendment to report AUD 23011 respecting the fraud and waste annual report. That recommendation B be struck in its entirety as follows. A, that appendices A and B to report AUD 23011 be received. And then from that point on, everything is stricken because we have already done this at council. So it's kind of redundant at this point. And I'd be looking for someone to second it. Chair, if you're willing to, that'd be great.
Councillor Wang enthusiastically beat me to it. So Councillor Wang will second it. And if I could just briefly ask in a really just lay person's terms, you're suggesting this is more of a housekeeping issue and this is not going to impact anything materially. Just wanted to confirm that. If you just give a nod, that would be great. I'm seeing the clerk is nodding. You're nodding. Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. On that, is there any discussion on the amendment? Councillor Huang would like to be added to the list. Go ahead, Councillor Huang.
So just some clarification then, we strike B, it is still going to come forward at the 2024 operating budget. Then at that time, we can just say that that item could potentially be deferred when we bring it up at budget. Is that correct?
Through the chair, Tamara Bates, Legislative Coordinator. So what's happening right now, it's being removed from this report because it is a decision already made by council, as it's been explained. So at council on November 22nd, there will be an amending motion brought forward to amend that original decision to refer it instead of referring it to the 2024 budget considerations, be referred to the considerations of the 2025 budget. So that deferral, as it were, will be taken care of in the amending motion.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thank you, and thanks for the extra explanation. I really appreciate that. Seeing that there are no further speakers on the amendment, all those in favor or opposed, we can go to the electronic vote. And the vote is up. Councillor Spatafor is in favor. And that carries 7-0. Thank you very much. Now we're moving on to discussion items.
Before we move on, we do have to have to approve the report as amended.
Thank you. If it's okay to use the same mover and seconder, Councillor Clark and seconded by Councillor Huang, we'll move the report as amended. And that vote is up now. And that carries 7-0. And now we'll go on to discussion items. Item 10, starting with item 10.1, which is the 2024 temporary borrowing and interim tax levy bylaw FCS 23109 citywide. That's the first item here. Just so folks know, on 10.3 and 10.4 have been withdrawn. And so we will only really have 10.1, 10.2, and 10.5, just so you know. On 10.1, may I have a mover and seconder to put the report on the floor? Councillor Huang, Councillor Taddison. Are there any questions for staff on the report? I see Councillor Huang and Councillor Clark. Councillor Clark, we'll start with you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. My question would be to Mr. Zagaric. So I've long heard you say we can't borrow money to pay for operating, that we borrow money for capital. So I'm trying to understand how this is permissible.
Through the chair, this really is a housekeeping item, and I'll get to the councillor's question, but the purpose for this agenda item is in the case where council does not approve a 2024 budget in a manner that would allow for the final two tax installments, so the June and September. If we were delayed in issuing our June and September, and it could be for a variety of reasons, it could be because of some form of natural disaster or just a delay in improving the budget process, this would allow staff to issue a temporary borrowing until such time as the budget was approved, and that we would collect those final two tax installment revenues to meet our financial obligations. So this is permitted in terms of in the case where, again, for a reason that a budget was not approved in a manner or time to allow for the billings and collections of the last two tax installments. I believe the city has exercised this authority only once, and that was immediately after amalgamation, just because of the challenges tied to amalgamation and reconciling all of the former municipalities into one municipality. So again, in terms of the authority, it could be a line of credit. The city has a line of credit of $65 million. We've never had to access it, but we could access it. So again, this would just allow the municipal staff to use those tools in order to meet our financial obligations.
Chair, may I ask a supplemental?
By all means.
If we have not done this except once after or post amalgamation, what is the rationale for doing it this time?
Through the chair, it really is what I'll describe as a housekeeping. It provides staff the authority if we needed to exercise this authority. We would come back to council. We would inform council leading up to having to exercise this authority. We would, through the budget process, inform council, as we have in the past, around expected timelines for approval of the budget to allow for those final 2 tax installments. But again, procedurally, the intent is just to allow staff to have the authority if we needed to exercise that authority. Just wanting to reassure is there would be communication in advance to council if we were in a situation of having to exercise this authority.
Respectfully, Chair, I'm not sure I heard the answer to the question. So if the only other time that this was done was post-amalgamation, what is the rationale for doing this now? Why couldn't we do this, if you need it, 3 months from now? Why do it preemptively?
Yeah. Through the chair, that is an option. We could defer this to 2024, leading up through the budget process. This has simply been our practice in previous years to seek this authority before the end of the calendar year, leading up to the upcoming fiscal and calendar year. So again, this could be deferred to 2024.
Chair, I'm a little bit confused because I've heard 2 things now. I've heard we've done this in the past, meaning every budget cycle. But then I also heard Mr. Zagaric say the only other time we did this was post-amalgamation. So if this is something that we have done every year, I can understand that rationale. But if this is something that we're doing preemptively this year, I'm trying to understand the rationale. So have we done this every year, Chair?
So through the chair, I'll start, and then I'm going to pass it over to Director McMullen because he's pointed out the one requirement for the timing of this report. To the councillor's question, yes. And as Director McMullen can speak to, why we do this at this time of year is this report provides the authority to collect the first 2 interim property taxes pending the approval of the budget. So again, the city issues 2 interim tax bills in February and April, and this report provides the authority of that continued practice to send out the interim bills, which are set at 50% of the previous year's property taxes for property owners. And again, that is the reason for the timing for this report and why this report comes forward annually at this time of year.
Thank you. That explanation helps me a great deal. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, and is that, thanks, Councillor Clark. Councillor Huang, asked and answered. I'll pass the chair to you, Councillor Huang. I would like to follow up on this a little bit more. So I understand that this report with this title, because I remember this coming up before, but is there anything different about this report from last year?
No, so through the chair, Brian McMullen, Director of Financial Planning, Administration and Policy. No, this is an annual, we do this annual report before the end of the year so that we can collect and bill the interim levies to all the taxpayers.
Yep, I understand. I just want to make sure there was no substantive differences between the report we did last year and the report for this year. There isn't. Hooray. I'll take the chair back. I don't see further questions or speakers on the subject. Any comments anyone want to make? Now's your moment. Not seeing anyone want to take advantage of that moment, we'll go to the vote. And that vote carries 7-0. We're now on to 10.2. Oh no. I'm pausing briefly for instruction.
Yes, I'm sorry. That vote was taken with noting Councillor Maureen Wilson as absent. She is in fact in the room and has voted would like to vote in favor, which I will amend for the minutes.
Thank you. We're on to 10.2, which is a recommendation for sustainable funding for the Hamilton Anti-Racism Resource Center CM2 0007E. It's a citywide. May I have a mover and a seconder to put the report on the floor? Councillor Spadafora and Councillor Clark. Are there any questions for staff on this report? Not seeing any. Anyone want to make any comments on the report? I see no comments. We'll go to the vote. The vote is up. And that vote carries 7-0. And thanks for folks who've attended today for that. There weren't questions or comments, but thank you for being here. Director Stahl and Lyndon George from HARC. Appreciate you being here. On that note, we're moving on from 10.2 to 10.5. The Development Charges Stakeholders Subcommittee Report 23-003 from November 9th, 2023. May I have a mover and a seconder to put the report on the floor? Councillor Maureen Wilson and Councillor Spadafora. Are there any questions for staff on the report? Any comments on the report? I see Councillor Huang, Councillor Alex Wilson, and Councillor Brad Clark. So we'll go first to Councillor Huang.
Thank you. Chair, the Development Charges Stakeholders Group had a very fulsome report, but there were some identified potential exemptions. So I think just for the edification of committee, there will be a public consultation, and ultimately those development charges will be sort of finalized in May, Q2-ish of the new year. So just for committee to know that there's opportunity for us to contribute to the Development Charges Stakeholders Group with our comments and with public consultation on what could potentially be exempted or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up on the list, I see Councillor Alex Wilson.
Thank you. And through the chair, I tried to get on for the questions, not the comments. I was just wondering if staff, apologies, I'm not on the Development Charges Subcommittee, but was reading through both the minutes here and the original kind of presentation, noticed some pretty substantial changes being recommended by the consultant. Would it be possible to just get a summary? I'm looking at the table from the original presentation that kind of lists some of the major changes. Seeing $160 million being recommended, potentially not being included in the downtown area. I'm wondering, is this an appropriate time to ask staff for just a bit of an high-level overview of what some of the major changes being recommended by the consultant are, as well as the potential kind of very high-level impacts or broad strokes of what that looks like?
Yeah, this is fine. I got a nod from folks, and if anyone's wanting to follow along, this is on page 24 of a 45-page presentation given to the Development Stakeholders Subcommittee, Development Charges, Stakeholder Subcommittee from November 9th. If you want to follow along, I have it in front of me. I think that's what you're talking about, Councillor Alex Wilson, so I will pass it now over to Director McMullen or whomever Director McMullen would like to refer to.
Go ahead, Kurt.
Good morning. It's Kirk Weaver, Manager of Budgets and Fiscal Policy in the Corporate Services Department. I can provide a high-level summary. The process for the development charges exemption review was undertaken by our consultant, CN Watson. They did some market research and reviewed our existing DC exemptions. And based on their research, put forward a number of, excuse me, proposals to modify our existing DC exemptions, probably the most significant one being elimination of a large portion of the downtown SEPA exemption that's currently at 40%, as well as some elimination of the industrial reduced rates. And the table that you referred to, the councillor referred to, I believe, lists a number of other exemptions, but those are the two most significant ones that have been proposed through the DC Stakeholders Subcommittee. It begins a process of consultation. So these are proposals that are being put to the public for consultation. The development charges background study, which will include these proposals, will be circulated early to mid-December, leading up to a public meeting at an AFNA meeting in February or early March, where further changes to these proposals based on public feedback through a number of sources, through the stakeholder subcommittee. We're working with communications and Morgan Stahl's team as well to ensure that we get the broadest possible opportunity for input on these proposals. And those would come back after the statutory public meeting for final approval and amendment to those proposals in May, in anticipation of adoption of a new bylaw by June 1st of 2024.
Thank you. I really appreciated that overview. Obviously not trying to get a whole committee's discussion in a quick there, but just not, oftentimes we receive minutes from a report, and this seems like it was a pretty substantial meeting getting that report back. So thanks for helping kind of dive in and get that. I appreciate that clarity.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is with respect to the timing of the study that was conducted by Mr. Scanlon and his team, and the recommendations that they have made with regards to these SEPA exemptions. My understanding of this process on a go-forward basis, we're not making any decisions today on the recommendations that came from Mr. Scanlon's group. After the public consultation, then we can dig into those issues at that time. For example, Section X says Section 26 respecting a 70% exemption for Class A office within the downtown community or SEPA group. But then it looks like we're eliminating most of the SEPA grant if it's for residential developments. So can I just get confirmation, I think it would be from Mr. McMullen, that all of those discussions with regards to what those exemptions will happen after the public consultation, and then we can finalize whether or not it's 70 or 60 or 40 or whatever the case is?
Yes, so through the chair, Brian McMullen. Yeah, so the minutes that are attached on today's AFNA or Audit, Finance and Admin Committee agenda, you're referring to item number 2, which is report FCS 23-103, exemptions and policies. So yeah, all of those particular policies that were presented to the DC Stakeholder Committee are now going to be contained in the public consultation process. So that those will then come back and for a future discussion at this committee.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Clark. I'll hand the chair over to Councillor Huang. I just want to make some comments about this briefly. First, thanks to Councillor Alex Wilson for really drawing attention to this chart. I'm also not on the Development Charges Stakeholder Subcommittee, so don't dig into their reports in great detail, but was interested to see that the current policy for exemptions and for development charges for the downtown community improvement plan area, $169 million. And we're going to have a savings when you look at all the different levels in the charts of about $300 million. Huge. And I really just want to say that I'm grateful that we're taking this step now and not waiting to continue to take it. This notion that we can continue to have record-breaking building permits in the downtown core that I've heard such a refrain here is wild to me in the context of continuing to call it a community, sort of a place that needs to be improved or that we have to incentivize people to build in. It sends the wrong message about downtown Hamilton. As a representative for downtown Hamilton, I don't like it. I never have, and I think that this is finally the time I'm grateful for where we can stop doing that incentivization. I know that there was a large push in 2016, 17, and 18 as part of the review of the downtown secondary plan to stop it then, which wasn't successful, and I think now we're finally there, and I'm grateful because I helped lead some of that work at the time, spent many days, months, and years working on that, and I'm grateful that we're here. I think it's an important moment. I appreciate the work of this subcommittee. Thanks. And I'll take the chair back. And we'll go to vote on receiving the report from the committee.
Just confirming, Mr. Chair, it is approving the recommendations in the report?
Yes, and that was moved by Councillor Maureen Wilson and seconded by Councillor Spadafora, if I recall correctly. And we will go to the vote, which is now up. That carries 8-0. And now we're moving on to notices of motion, 12.1. And we have a notice of motion from Councillor Maureen Wilson. 12.1 disaster relief assistance, water main break at Hyde Park Avenue and Glenside Avenue for November 12th. Councillor Maureen Wilson, could you introduce your notice of motion? And before you do so, could you let us know who the seconder will be?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, pardon me. I just made a mistake there. Let's go back in time. Can you introduce your notice of motion? Then we're going to have a motion to waive the rules, as I understand you wish to do. And for that, we'll need a seconder.
Thank you. So the order of sequence is I'm seeking council or committee's approval to waive the rules. My seconder is Councillor Spadafora. Seeking that permission, please.
Sure. Could you let people know, if you don't mind, just the reason for why you're asking to waive the rules? Because I know it's a question someone will ask, so I'm just preempting that.
My request is based on the significance of the water main break and its impact on people who live in the area, and I think the comfort and the need that this would provide them immediately. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's been moved and seconded by Councillor Wilson and Councillor Spadafora. I don't see anyone making comments on waiving the rules. We will go to that vote.
No comments.
That vote's up.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you. That carries 8-0. Now we're on to the motion itself, which is transformed from a notice of motion to a real motion at this time. And I assume that it's moved by yourself and seconded by Councillor Spadafora again?
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
Take it away. Please introduce your motion and speak to it if you wish. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, therefore be it resolved, please. You can listen to my long, droning voice. A, that for the purpose of invoking the Residential Municipal Disaster Relief Assistance Program for Basement Flooding, Council declares the water main break event at the intersection of Hyde Park Avenue and Glenside Avenue of November 12th of this year as a disaster for all affected residential properties within Ward 1 in the City of Hamilton. B, that payment of claims be based on compassionate grounds only and shall not be construed as an admission of liability on the part of the city. C, that the compassionate grant be payable in an amount being the lesser of $1,000, the level of the resident's insurance deductible or the resident's actual expense and loss incurred as a result of flooding, and further that the grant otherwise be determined under the eligibility criteria for the Residential Municipal Disaster Relief Assistance Program for basement flooding as approved by Council on August 9th, 2006 in Report FCS 06007, respecting proposed Residential Municipal Disaster Relief Assistance Program for basement flooding. D, that the payment of the claims be funded from the Waterworks Reserve, which is 108015. And E, that staff be authorized, if necessary, to retain independent adjusting services for the administration of claims under the Residential Municipal Disaster Relief Assistance Program for basement flooding, and that these administrative costs be funded from the Waterworks Reserve 108015. If I can speak to it briefly, please.
And before you do, just wanted to point out a really small thing here. In C, we have the wrong lesser. We have lesser as in somebody who would be involved in a lease instead of lesser as in fewer. So on the first line of C, it should say that the compassionate grant be paid in amount being the lesser of, not the lessor of. That's all. Otherwise, thank you, and go ahead.
Thank you. As it states, this past Sunday, November 12th, at about 1 in the afternoon, there was a significant water main break of a 500 millimeter iron dated just under 70 years. The amount of water was such that it required the closure of Aberdeen Avenue from Dundurn to just past the golf course at Studholme. I was on site at the time and then was on site once the water was closed. I have never seen that amount of water before. And I just wanted to thank so much the quick response of Hamilton Water. Thank you very much for all the information you have provided to the always present, always reliable Mr. Dave Alberton for coming in on his day off and for helping me understand what was going on and being so accessible to anyone who asked him a question, and to Director McCauley for all of his responses and his accessibility as well. The work in cleaning up after was immediate, and the remediation is ongoing, but very, very quick. I would like to highlight the resiliency and the neighborliness of everyone on site who just grabbed snow shovels and just started helping each other out. It was quite a remarkable sort of barn-raising experience, but not a surprise if you know this neighborhood. So it's for your consideration. Thank you. And thanks to my seconder very much.
I don't see further speakers on the list on this motion, so we shall go to the vote. And the vote is up. That vote carries 8-0.
Thank you, colleagues.
And now we're on to, I believe we may be on to that special moment of adjournment. And Councillor Spadafora was, I would say, proactive in signaling his movement here, but Councillor Taddison not far behind. And so a move by Councillor Spadafora and seconded by Councillor Taddison is our motion to adjourn. And that motion is before you. Councillor Spadafora is in favor. And that carries 8-0. We shall adjourn. Thanks for being here for the Audit, Finance, and Administration Committee, and see you all next time.